What I'm going to be presenting today really is a set of ideas that we've been working up. It's not necessarily a kind of fully fledged campaign that we're launching yet, or indeed ever. And it's really what it is really a kind of collection of ideas stemming from different areas of work, some work around global taxation, some work around the kind of agendas that we might start to think about as to replace the Millennium Development Goals as the sort of central idea in international consensus on development, and our response also to the financial crisis, and certainly, some of the issues that Milo was talking about are very relevant. So really the kind of things that I'm talking about today is the sort of pulling together of a lot of different agendas within ActionAid to kind of see what comes out, really, and see what the response is. Starting from thinking about global inequality. And as Milo said, our interest in this comes partly simply from an interest in poverty, and one can't, if one's focusing on poverty, extremes of poverty, it's very difficult not to then be drawn into a kind of thinking about inequality, because clearly, that is the sort of, if one's concerned with poverty and the potential for reducing poverty, one also has to look at the other end of the spectrum and see what other money there is out there and who has it. If once, in thinking about how much or little of it to transfer to those people that have least. I think the interesting thing that I found in sort of paying more attention to the whole discussion and thinking around global inequality over the last year or so is how much consensus there is that it's very large and not a very good thing. And as the quotes, as the sort of this collection of words up there shows, there is a kind of surprising degree of consensus, I think, across the political spectrum and across some different individuals that global inequality is very, very large and too large. And I know that's not surprising, when you think about the kind of headline figures, the richest 500 people in the world hold about as much wealth as the poorest 400 million. It's sort of not difficult to see why people reach the conclusion that this has just got beyond out of control, and it is just global inequalities have now got to the stage that they're indefensible, really, on any level. What I found very surprising, given the very high degree of consensus that global inequality is too big, is how little attention there is to policies to tackle it. There's been a lot of discussion, obviously, within developed countries and countries with their own welfare states about the potential for tackling inequalities within countries, and the issues around redistributive taxation and welfare states and so on are very well rehearsed within the kind of domestic politics of a lot of countries. But in terms of policies specifically designed to look at international inequalities, there's almost nothing. There are a few things now coming onto the agenda as a consequence of the financial crisis that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but really it's kind of absent from the debate. Now, part of the reason for sort of starting to think about this work is to wonder whether this could be the moment to start to put inequality rather than simply poverty onto the global policy agenda. Obviously, the financial crisis, as a number of people have said, presents a kind of set of opportunities here in terms of, change, as Tim said very clearly, changing perceptions of people at the top. We've also at a particular moment in terms of a kind of the international discussion on poverty and on the people at the bottom of the income distribution as we get closer to 2015 and people start to think about, what is going to be the kind of guiding set of principles and the guiding strategy for international efforts to reduce poverty after 2015. There's an opportunity there to start to think about sort of different ways of thinking about poverty globally, and clearly global inequality could be a part of that. Now, I think it's worth perhaps just thinking about sort of what we want a global agenda on poverty to do. If you're thinking about global inequality as becoming a sort of concept to galvanise support on this, we want it to do two things. We want it to raise money, clearly, and the MDGs and the sort of 2015 targets have been very, very successful in doing that. It's arguable that you wouldn't have got the kind of very high, the increases in aid that we saw in in 2005 in Gleneagles and so on, without that kind of single strong idea of the MDGs. But we also need a kind of international agreement on poverty reduction to create the particular changes that are actually needed to reduce poverty, which go far beyond simply raising money and spending it. And I think on that, by that criteria, it's arguable that the MDGs have been less successful. Another reason for the sort of interest in the lack of discussion of inequality and redistribution as a global strategy to reduce poverty has been that is obviously within countries, that is the heart of how we tackle poverty. We have basically a redistributive tax system. We take money from richer people, if not the richest, and we spend it on the poorer people through welfare programs, through health, through education spending, and so on. So it's all the more surprising to me once you start to sort of think about the whole discourse on inequality and poverty reduction and development, not just within the development community, but also within the sort of general discourse on poverty within countries, that redistribution, tax and spend, essentially is so totally absent from the international poverty agenda, when those same governments, the key donor governments, that's how they tackle poverty at home, and yet it's completely absent from the way that they talk about poverty abroad, which is interesting in terms of the kind of anthropology of policy making. If one were to go down this kind of redistribution route as a strategy for policy making, what would it look like? Well, clearly, I really hate the term global welfare state. I think it has all the wrong connotations about welfare dependency and all the things that we don't want to kind of lead the poverty, the sort of development debate onto. But in the absence of a better term, I'm going to use it and put it in quotation marks. What would it do if one were to shift away from a kind of MDG focus to something along the lines of proposing a global welfare state? Well, what would it look like? The first change, clearly, in terms of our aspirations and what we were trying to do, would be that you'd be shifting from targets based on averages. You know, we want to halve poverty, we want to raise the average this, lower the average that, to a commitment to individuals. So rather than halving poverty, you would be guaranteeing every individual person in the world a basic minimum income, for example. So I think in terms of some of the problems of the MDGs, this could be quite powerful. Because obviously at country level in some countries what you see is you could hide the sort of difficult realities of power and the kind of hardest to reach, the most excluded groups within the average. So you can look as though on average you're doing very well, but you're actually not challenging the kind of entrenched power relationships and the things that make poverty reduction so very difficult. Whereas looking at things on an individual level would mean that you are unable to hide those groups who are sort of systematically disadvantaged within the average. So I think that could be one of the kind of quite powerful shifts towards a sort of more welfare state individual type agenda. Clearly one would have to tackle, one would have to sort of think about the balance between the responsibility of national governments and international efforts and so on, the same problems really that sort of bedeviled development efforts forever, ever since development started and it became the business of one country to start to think about what might happen in another country. You've had the problem of the sort of limits of where it's acceptable for one country because it's got more money or more power to start to pontificate about what happens in another. And I think obviously this problem, the problem doesn't go away with the reconceptualisation of development. I think in terms of whether this would work as a sort of post-MDG aspiration, a kind of public agenda, I think it could be more inspiring, to talk about ending poverty rather than just halving it, to really have in some ways, a kind of higher aspiration can be more off-putting because it seems harder to reach. On the other hand, to have a really concrete, to really make people sort of buy into the idea that one could actually end poverty is much more inspiring than saying, well, let's halve it. And I think particularly this is something that we have to think about in relation to, that graph that Tim had up about the declining support for for welfare states within OECD countries, I think one could see the same graph and probably a much steeper line in terms of support for aid. And, you know, there's a lot of challenges now to aid, to whether, you know, whether aid works, whether we should be doing it, whether in the context of massively squeezed public spending post-financial crisis in this country, we should be sending the money that we do send overseas. And I think people who are interested in kind of international cooperation and development and basically believe that some money should flow from rich countries to poor countries, you know, we need to really think about how we're going to defend that and what are the arguments that we're going to use to defend that in the future. I think what's interesting in terms of the declining support for development, and perhaps is different to the reasons for the kind of challenging the welfare state in the UK, is that it's much less about whether or not individual people deserve the aid, because obviously people strongly believe that, you know, I think the sense that individual people in poor countries who are poor, there's a much bigger sense that they're not poor through their own fault. I think there's a much bigger sense that actually they are poor through force of circumstances, and that's possibly a very big difference in the way the public think about poverty at home and poverty abroad. And people are quite happy to give their money to charities who use the kind of, you know, yes, you know, we will give your money to this particular child or this particular community. The thing that makes people really cynical about sending aid money overseas is less about whether the individuals who are going to receive it are deserving and more whether the governments are going to abuse it. Obviously, there's the endless discussions about corruption and, you know, the sort of whether it's all going to be spent on BMWs and gold taps. And that's the reason why people are very suspicious and cynical of aid, primarily in the UK. And clearly a sort of target which focused more on individuals would potentially be a way of mobilising that kind of sense of accountability and the sense of the sort of belief that official aid money, as well as money that people give through organisations like Oxfam and ActionAid and Save the Children, would actually be going to the people who people want to help. Nope, it's not working. The other side, obviously, one could, you know, the other side of any sort of global welfare state type proposal is how one would afford it. It would be hugely, hugely more expensive than require vast amounts more money than we currently spend on aid. There's sort of estimates for how much it would cost to actually to provide everybody in every country with a sort of minimum level of income and a very basic set of social services, ranges from something over 1 trillion to nearly $4 trillion US a year. Now, actually, post-financial crisis, that doesn't seem quite so much. We're suddenly all used to talking in trillions in a way that we perhaps weren't a year ago. But it is still an enormous jump from levels of aid spending at the moment. And even if some of this were to be funded by domestic spending within the richer, you know, countries like Brazil and India and so on, it's still a vast amount of money for the international community to come up with, which is where the kind of tax side of the tax and spend comes in. You couldn't fund this just through aid. You'd have to shift towards much more predictable and globally redistributive mechanisms for funding any kind of global welfare state individual commitments type system. There are all kinds of things on the table. This is very much the direction of travel of discussions around development finance, where I think there is a recognition that we probably very possibly reach the sort of high watermark of aid, of official government-to-government aid spending. And if you're interested in expanding the amounts of money flowing from rich countries or people to poor countries and people, you have to look for other ways to do it. There's obviously been an enormous amount of fuss in the paper recently about the financial transaction tax. There's discussion in the climate change negotiations around carbon taxes. The G20 have been working on tax havens and global tax avoidance. There are a lot of processes in train, and there are even more being discussed, you know, within NGOs, within think tanks, and within governments about how one might set up redistributive taxation globally to fund this kind of, you know, much more ambitious program for international targets on development. I should say when I presented this idea at various forums at different times, and reactions range, sort of tends to really polarise people. So sometimes people stand up and say, but that's just all, that's really not radical enough, that's just a sticking plaster. If you're seriously interested in tackling inequality, don't just think about redistributing incomes after the event. You have to actually look at much more of the sort of structural reasons for inequality, and very much where Kate started, around assets and really challenging the kind of systems that give rise to that level of inequality in the first place. And certainly I don't disagree with that, but I don't see this as in any way kind of mutually exclusive to that. In fact, I think that redistributing incomes and giving the poorest people a more certain income, better level of services, could actually have all kind of unintended or unknown consequences in terms of galvanising political activity, giving people the kind of resources and the confidence to actually start to mobilise more politically and create more kind of coalitions for the sort of structural change that actually in the end would arrest these growing international inequalities that people have already talked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much.